There's a stretch of San Francisco waterfront so radioactive that two men went to federal prison for lying about how contaminated it actually was. Not during the Cold War. Recently. The company hired to clean it up faked the soil tests, and homes went up anyway, right on top of that same ground. So tonight, I want to ask you something simple. If the people paid to tell you a place is safe get caught lying about it in a courtroom, would you still trust the next test they hand you? Let's start with the crime, because I think it tells you everything about what kind of story this actually is before we even get to the history behind it. In 2012, a supervisor named Justin Hubbard drove a company truck out past the marked boundary of the area he'd been assigned to test for radiation. He filled a bucket with clean dirt. He drove it back. He emptied out the sample bags that were supposed to contain soil from the actual contaminated zone and refilled them with dirt that had never been anywhere near it. Then he slapped barcode stickers onto those bags, mislabeling exactly where the samples had supposedly come from, and shipped them off to a lab for testing. His supervisor, a man named Stephen Rolfe, later admitted he told his own team to do the exact same thing, on his own estimate, around 20 separate times that year. Both men eventually pleaded guilty in federal court. Both were sentenced to 8 months in prison. And when investigators went back and reviewed the actual scope of what these men and the company they worked for had done across the site, the numbers were almost impossible to believe. A follow-up review by the federal government and 2 state agencies found that 97% of the samples from one parcel of land and 90% from another were considered suspect. Not a handful of shortcuts, not one bad afternoon. Nearly every single test result the public had been told to trust, across 2 entire sections of one of the most contaminated pieces of land in the country, may have been fabricated. The company responsible for all of this was called Tetra Tech, hired by the United States Navy, specifically because the land in question needed to be certified clean enough for people to actually live on it. And that's the detail I want you to hold on to for the rest of this video, because it's the hinge everything else swings on. This wasn't a chemical plant somebody forgot to inspect. This was one of the most closely watched, federally regulated cleanup projects in modern American history, run by a licensed contractor, overseen by the Navy, the EPA, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and it still got faked. Right now, as I'm telling you this, homes already sit on parts of this land. More are planned. And just this past summer, a federal judge ruled that a specific piece of Cold War-era nuclear liability law actually shields Tetra Tech from being sued directly by the homeowners living on top of what it tested. We'll come back to exactly how that happened, and exactly what it means for the people living there right now. But first, I need to take you back nearly 80 years to explain why there was ever anything radioactive buried in this soil in the first place. The land itself goes back much further than the Navy. Hunters Point began its life as a commercial shipyard all the way back in 1870, a working stretch of San Francisco's southeastern waterfront known for building and repairing ships long before the military ever got involved. It stayed that way, industrial and unremarkable, for decades. Everything changed in the years leading up to the Second World War. In 1937, the United States Navy purchased the property, and by the early 1940s it had transformed into a full military shipyard, repairing and outfitting warships as the country geared up for a war that would define the entire century. That expansion needed labor, and a lot of it, fast, and the shipyard became one of the major destinations of what historians now call the Second Great Migration, as thousands of black workers left the American South and came west for defense jobs that simply hadn't existed for them before. Hunters Point, and the neighborhood that grew up around it, Bayview Hunters Point, became one of the most significant black communities on the entire West Coast, almost overnight, built directly around the shipyard's payroll. Then, in July of 1945, something happened at this shipyard that most people who live near it today have absolutely no idea about. The core fissile components of the very first atomic bomb, the one that would be dropped on Hiroshima only weeks later, were loaded onto a ship called the USS Indianapolis, docked right here at Hunters Point, before it set out across the Pacific toward the island of Tinian. Think about that for a second. Before the world had ever seen what an atomic weapon could actually do, before Hiroshima, before Nagasaki, the literal physical heart of that first bomb passed through this exact stretch of San Francisco shoreline. That's not a footnote. That's the opening scene of everything that follows. Because a little over a year later, the Navy brought the aftermath of that same new weapon right back to this same dock. In the summer of 1946, the United States detonated 2 atomic bombs over a fleet of decommissioned and captured warships anchored at Bikini Atoll, a test series called Operation Crossroads, designed to answer one simple question the country hadn't yet had to face. What does an atomic bomb actually do to a navy? Some of the ships that survived those blasts, mangled but still floating, dangerously radioactive, were towed thousands of miles back across the Pacific Ocean, and several of them ended up right back here at Hunters Point for inspection and decontamination. And I want you to actually picture what that decontamination looked like, because it wasn't done with robots or remote arms. It was done by hand. Shipyard workers, wearing minimal protection by today's standards, sandblasted and scrubbed radioactive Navy ships with brushes and hoses, trying to physically wash nuclear fallout off of steel hulls, one section at a time. One of those ships, the USS Independence, turned out to be so severely contaminated that decontamination simply wasn't possible. In 1951, rather than continue trying to clean it, the Navy towed it back out to sea and deliberately sank it off the coast of California, near the Farallon Islands, dumping an entire irradiated aircraft carrier into the Pacific rather than figure out what else to do with it. Here's the part of the Independence's story that most people have no idea happened, because it isn't old history at all. In 2015, more than 60 years after the Navy scuttled it, a research team using sonar mapping equipment rediscovered the wreck sitting almost perfectly intact on the ocean floor, roughly 1,000 feet down, not far from the Farallon Islands sanctuary. Its flight deck, its hull, even a fighter plane still lashed to the deck, all still recognizable, sitting quietly in the dark, decades after anyone stopped thinking about it. Researchers who examined the wreck confirmed that some radioactivity almost certainly remains inside the ship's structure to this day, sealed away under 1,000 feet of cold Pacific water, but present nonetheless. I bring this up because I think it's the perfect symbol for how this entire story actually works. Nothing about this contamination ever really disappeared. It just got moved somewhere quieter, sunk, buried, sealed, or repackaged, and left for someone, or something, decades later to accidentally stumble back onto. Out of this entire chaotic effort to understand what radiation actually did and how to clean it up, the Navy formally established a research facility right there at the shipyard in 1946, expanding it 2 years later into what became known as the Naval Radiological Defense Laboratory. For more than 2 decades, until it finally closed in 1969, this lab conducted some of the most extensive applied nuclear research in the entire country, right in the middle of a working-class San Francisco neighborhood. Researchers studied how radiation moved through ship materials. They tested decontamination methods. They ran experiments on animals to understand radiation exposure. And through all of it, waste from this research, along with waste from the decontamination of those Bikini Fleet ships, had to go somewhere. Some of it was packaged into steel drums and dumped straight into the ocean. But safety protocols at the time didn't require any special handling for waste generated by the less contaminated support vessels, the ones that hadn't been anywhere near the actual blast. Which means, according to researchers who've studied the site's history since, it's entirely possible that radioactive waste from all of this work was simply buried in the shipyard's own landfill or washed straight into San Francisco Bay, with nobody keeping careful track of exactly how much or exactly where. Here's the open loop I want to plant right now, because I'm going to come back to it in a few minutes, and I think you'll want the answer by then. For decades after this lab closed, the Navy's own official paperwork didn't fully account for everywhere its own researchers had actually worked. Declassified documents later showed that a number of buildings and sites the lab had genuinely used were left completely off the Navy's own list of locations with potential radiological contamination, discovered only after outside reporters went digging through records the Navy hadn't exactly volunteered. So hold that thought. An official government list of contaminated sites that the government's own history proves was incomplete. We'll circle back to why that matters so much once we get to the cleanup itself. The shipyard kept operating as a working naval repair facility for years after the lab shut down, eventually deactivating in 1974 and getting leased out to private ship repair companies for a while longer. But by 1986, both hazardous chemical contamination and low-level radiological contamination had been formally identified across the site. And 3 years later, in 1989, Hunters Point Naval Shipyard was placed on the federal Superfund list, officially designating it one of the most polluted locations in the entire United States. 866 acres, right on the water, in the middle of a major American city, contaminated with a mix of radionuclides including plutonium-239, cesium-137, and strontium-90, alongside a long list of more conventional industrial pollutants, solvents, PCBs, heavy metals, and pesticides that had accumulated across decades of shipyard operations. I think it's worth actually explaining what those 3 specific radionuclides do inside a human body, rather than just listing their names and moving on, because each one behaves in its own uniquely dangerous way. Strontium-90 is sometimes called a bone seeker because chemically it behaves almost identically to calcium, which means a body that absorbs it will actually mistake it for calcium and deposit it directly into bone tissue and bone marrow, the exact place where blood cells are produced, and leave it there, irradiating that tissue from the inside for years. Cesium-137 spreads differently, distributing itself throughout soft tissue and muscle rather than concentrating in one place, which makes it easier for the body to eventually eliminate, but also means that while it's present, it's irradiating a much broader range of organs at once. Plutonium-239 is, in some ways, the most dangerous of the 3 specifically because it's the least mobile. It doesn't travel efficiently through water or dissolve easily, which sounds reassuring until you understand what that actually means in practice. It tends to stay wherever it lands, in soil, in dust, in a lung that happened to breathe in a single contaminated particle, delivering a concentrated, localized radiation dose to that one specific spot for years or decades. 3 different chemicals, 3 different mechanisms. All 3 sitting somewhere in the same 866 acres, and until very recently, nobody outside the Navy could say with any real confidence exactly where. I want to pause the timeline here for a second and talk about who was actually living next to all of this while it was happening, because I think it's the part of the story that gets skipped over the fastest, and it shouldn't be. Bayview Hunters Point, the neighborhood that grew up around this shipyard's wartime jobs, has carried a staggering, disproportionate share of San Francisco's industrial pollution ever since. By some estimates, this single neighborhood has been home to roughly 1/3 of the entire city's toxic waste sites, more than 100 documented brownfield sites, over 180 leaking underground fuel tanks, and more than 124 separate hazardous waste facilities, all concentrated in one relatively small, historically black community on the city's southeastern edge. In 2006, a city public health survey found that 86% of babies born in Bayview developed severe asthma before they'd even reached kindergarten. The neighborhood has consistently recorded the highest rates of asthma hospitalization anywhere in San Francisco. Public health assessments conducted through the 1990s documented elevated rates of breast cancer, cervical cancer, and chronic disease hospitalization, worse across the board than almost anywhere else in the city. By 2010, when Speaker Nancy Pelosi announced additional federal funding for the cleanup, she stated plainly that residents had waited almost 36 years for the Navy to fulfill its cleanup obligations, while the neighborhood around them continued to experience the highest rates of asthma, infant mortality, and both breast and cervical cancer anywhere in the city. I don't think that's a coincidence, and I don't think the community around Hunters Point has ever really believed it was one either. Before we even get to Tetra Tech, though, I need to tell you about the first time this exact same pattern played out, years earlier, with the very developer building homes on this land in the first place, because I think it's the moment that should have warned everyone about what was coming. In 2005, a company called Lennar Corporation acquired a piece of the former shipyard, known as Parcel A, with plans to build one of the largest residential developments in the neighborhood's history. The following year, heavy machinery began grading a hillside on that parcel, breaking apart naturally, occurring serpentine rock, the same striking green-tinted bedrock California later chose as its official state rock, which happens to also be a natural source of asbestos fibers when disturbed. All that dust was supposed to be suppressed with water spray as it was generated. According to residents and later investigations, it wasn't, at least not consistently. In 2008, one air monitoring reading at the excavation site came back at 138,000 asbestos fibers per cubic meter. California law requires an automatic work shutdown at readings above 16,000 fibers per cubic meter. The reading came in at more than 8 times that legal shutdown threshold. Work did not stop. A community organizer named Tessie Esther, who lived nearby, described what those years actually felt like on the ground, rather than in a compliance report. She said she was faced every single day with a sick child or a child with a bloody nose and attributed it directly to the toxic dust drifting off the grading site. Parents, teachers, school nurses, and custodians packed a hearing at the San Francisco Board of Education in August of 2007, testifying about mass exposure they believed was coming from the hilltop grading, and the board voted unanimously to shut it down. 3 of Lennar's own employees, including an administrative assistant and 2 others who had raised internal concerns about the dust, later filed their own lawsuit against the company, alleging Lennar maintained what their complaint described as a code of silence, specifically designed to discourage anyone on staff from asking too many questions about the site's safety. Their attorney, Angela Aliotto, didn't mince words about why she believed the company felt comfortable operating that way in the first place. The firm thought it would escape responsibility for pollution problems, she said, because the neighbors included poor people and racial minorities. And in a 2007 internal email later made public, the city's own asbestos program manager appeared to actively discourage further investigation into the health risks, writing that the available facts seemed to be on the department's side. So, in his words, we should stay away from trying to create more data. Read that line again. A public health official, on the record, suggesting the department avoid gathering more information specifically because the information it already had was more convenient. Regulators eventually did act, fining Lennar $587,000 in 2006 and $515,000 again in 2008, both times for failing to properly monitor and control asbestos dust generated by its own construction work. But here's the part of this story that I think matters most, because it's the exact same pattern that would repeat itself, almost beat for beat, when the Tetra Tech fraud came to light years later. In 2008, a group of roughly 6,500 Bayview Hunters Point residents filed a lawsuit against Lennar and its contractors, alleging public nuisance, negligence, environmental racism, and emotional distress tied directly to the asbestos exposure. An appeals court ultimately ruled against them, not because the violations hadn't happened. The fines already proved that much, but because the plaintiffs, in the court's own words, failed to present sufficient evidence connecting the asbestos-laden dust specifically to injuries in their own bodies. Causation, the court found, hadn't been proven to the necessary legal standard. Thousands of residents, documented violations, confirmed fines, and still, no one held individually liable for what happened to the people breathing that dust, because proving that one specific cloud of dust caused one specific person's specific illness years or decades later is nearly impossible to do inside a courtroom, even when everyone involved already agrees the violation itself was real. So by the time Tetra Tech's fraud came to light years later, this community had already lived through one entire cycle of exactly this same story: a documented violation, a public health official minimizing the risk, a fine that felt almost decorative next to the scale of the harm, and a courtroom that ultimately couldn't connect the dots in a way the law required. I think that history matters enormously, because it means the Tetra Tech scandal wasn't some unprecedented shock to this neighborhood. It was, in a lot of ways, exactly what residents here had already learned to expect. Which brings us back to the cleanup itself, and the part of this story that I think crosses the line from tragedy into something closer to a genuine crime. The Navy hired Tetra Tech specifically to test parcels of this contaminated land for radiation and to remediate any section where the readings came back too high. This wasn't a minor subcontract. It was the entire foundation the redevelopment of this land was supposed to rest on. The process meant to guarantee that when new homes finally went up on former shipyard property, the families moving in could actually trust the ground beneath them. Instead, according to the guilty pleas of Rolfe and Hubbard themselves, technicians were directed, repeatedly, to substitute clean soil from outside the marked test areas in place of the actual contaminated samples they were supposed to be collecting. An internal Navy review found that roughly half of all the soil samples across the site may have been falsified or manipulated in some way. A second, independent review by the EPA and state regulators found that number climbed as high as 97% on one parcel alone. Internal memos later made public by an environmental advocacy group revealed that the EPA itself believed the fraud was even more widespread than what had already been confirmed. If you've made it this far, I think you already understand why this particular case sticks with people longer than most contamination stories, because usually these stories are about negligence, about a company or a government agency that simply didn't take a danger seriously enough decades ago. This one is different. This is a case where the actual verification process, the system specifically built to protect a community from exactly this kind of danger, was itself the thing that got corrupted. And in a minute, I'm going to show you what happened when the people living on top of that soil actually tried to hold someone accountable for it, because the answer might make you angrier than the fraud itself. The Department of Justice eventually joined a whistleblower lawsuit against Tetra Tech, alleging the company had misrepresented the source of its soil samples and falsified radiological survey data collected from buildings across the site. Beyond the two supervisors who went to prison, the broader legal fight dragged on for years. A group of Bayview Hunters Point residents filed their own lawsuit, seeking $27 billion in damages, arguing the fraud had directly endangered the health of an entire community that had already been carrying more than its share of San Francisco's pollution for generations. In January of 2025, Tetra Tech agreed to a $97 million settlement tied to the broader fraud allegations. $97 million against a community that had asked for $27 billion, and against contamination that, depending on which parcel and which radionuclide you're talking about, may take decades more to fully understand, let alone finish cleaning. And then, just this past August, something happened that I think perfectly captures how these stories almost always end. A federal judge ruled that a piece of Cold War-era federal legislation called the Price-Anderson Act, a law originally written to limit the liability of the nuclear power industry, actually protects Tetra Tech from being sued directly by the homeowners now living on land the company was paid to certify as safe. Read that back one more time. A law written decades ago to shield nuclear contractors from crippling lawsuits is now being used to shield a company that a federal court already confirmed engaged in fraud, criminal fraud, with two of its own supervisors sitting in prison to prove it, from the very homeowners whose safety that fraud was supposed to guarantee. This is happening right now. Not in some archived case study from the 1970s. This is a live, unresolved legal question decided within the last few months, and it did not go in the community's favor. Here's where that open loop I planted earlier finally comes back around, because I think it deserves to land right here, next to everything you just heard. Remember how the Navy's own official contamination records, the map used to decide which sites even needed testing in the first place, were later shown to have left out locations the Naval Radiological Defense Laboratory had genuinely used, buildings that had simply been razed by the time anyone thought to check them properly. So think about what that actually means, layered on top of the Tetra Tech fraud and layered on top of the Lennar asbestos scandal before it. It's not just that the tests on the known contaminated parcels may have been faked. It's that the very map used to decide where testing needed to happen at all was already incomplete, decades before Tetra Tech's trucks ever showed up, and that the developer building homes on the parts everyone already knew about had already been caught cutting corners on the exact same kind of monitoring years earlier. 3 separate failures, stacked directly on top of each other. One from the government that built the danger, one from the developer racing to build over it, and one from the contractor hired to certify it gone. If this is the kind of story that makes your blood pressure spike a little, stick around, because this channel exists entirely to dig up cases exactly like this one, the places where the danger isn't just buried in the ground, it's buried in the paperwork too, and subscribing means you won't miss the next site we uncover. And meanwhile, redevelopment hasn't stopped. Developers, most prominently Lennar and its successor company 5 Point, have already built homes on portions of this land that were previously part of the Superfund site, and both companies have plans to build thousands more, even with the asbestos fines, the fraud allegations, the criminal convictions, and the ongoing litigation sitting in the public record for anyone to find. Families are moving in. Children are growing up, playing in yards built on soil that a licensed federal contractor was caught, on tape, in sworn testimony, deliberately faking the safety of. The Navy insists the certified sections are safe. The residents who filed that $27 billion lawsuit clearly don't share that confidence. And honestly, given everything you've just heard, I'm not sure I'd blame them. So let's go back to where we started tonight, because I think the question I opened with actually has a real answer now, even if it isn't a comfortable one. I asked you whether you'd still trust the next test after watching the people paid to run it get caught lying in a courtroom. Here's what I've landed on after putting this entire story together. The Navy brought the first atomic bomb through this dock in 1945. It brought irradiated ships back to this same dock in 1946 and let workers scrub them down by hand. It buried and quietly lost track of its own contamination map for decades. A developer got caught blowing asbestos dust over a school and a neighborhood and paid a fine that barely registered against its own construction budget. And when the moment finally came to hand this land back to the public, to actually verify it was safe, the company hired to do that one specific job chose, repeatedly, deliberately, to fake it instead, and a court has now ruled the law protects them for having done so. So no, I don't think you should trust the next test, not automatically, not just because someone in a uniform or a hard hat hands you a piece of paper and calls it certified. Hunters Point didn't get poisoned by accident. It got poisoned, tested, mistested, fined, resold, and quietly rebuilt on, one signature at a time, and somewhere out past the Farallon Islands, 1,000 feet down, an entire aircraft carrier is still sitting on the ocean floor, waiting for the next person to accidentally find it. That's it for this one. The videos on your screen right now go even further into the place's history quietly poisoned and hoped nobody would ever ask about again. Go watch them.